This is the 2023 book review. I'm going to go through a bunch of the books that I've read this year, maybe not all of them, but I'm going to go through as many of them as I can and tell you what I thought about them, whether they were worth, and give you just a little book review from my perspective of the books that I've read. I read a lot of books throughout the year, so I figured this is a good way to share just some of the things I'm reading and what I thought about them and give you maybe some new books to put on your book list for the coming years. So I'm going to start off with the books that I've categorized as essential reading, and I'm going to start from the top there and go through the essential reads that I think are also worthy of repeat reading. And after I go through that, then I'll go through the essential reads that maybe you don't need to reread multiple times. And then I'm going to go through just some things that I think are good for a repeat reading. And then I'll go through all of the rest of them, as many as I can in this video. And let's get started. So I'm going to start with what I thought is the best book that I've read this entire year. It's called 4,000 Weeks, and it's by Oliver Burkeman. And it's a book. The tagline of the book, I believe, is called Time Management for Mortals. And it really puts into context how much time we have here as human beings. The average human lives 4,000 weeks, according to Oliver Burkeman. And it really, when you break it down into that granular sort of thing, life starts to have a different context to it. And he does this really good job of taking that and then looking at it in this kind of the scope of human history and looking at it and like what's really important versus what's not important and the idea of time management. And what I really like about the book, aside from the fact that it's just a really good wake-up call about what's important to you in your life, is that Oliver Burkeman, like me, he was like a productivity geek. He was into like finding every hack, every way of being more organized and prioritizing their to-do lists and all that sort of stuff. And so for him to step back and take his hands off the wheel from clutching it so much, I thought was really impactful. It was a really phenomenal book. I recommended it to basically everyone after I read it. I've read it once already. I think it's going to be one of those books. There's another book called Essentialism that I read a few years ago by Greg McKeown. That's like in that same vein of like, come back to it time and time again, because it's like a wake up, a refresher when you get too in the minutia of the small things in your life, or even just the scariness of the big picture. Books like this, I think, are really helpful. I read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is a classic by Paulo Freire, who wrote a lot about this sort of banker mentality of education. And I read another book, actually, that I'll talk about in a minute by Bell Hooks called Teaching to Transgress. Actually, I'll just mention those two at the same time. Both of those are on my essential and repeat reading, because what they talk about is the model of education and the model of learning and thinking, and specifically about how so much of education is what both of them described. I believe Bell Hooks inspired by Paulo Freire's work, about essentially that students are like these banks that educators make deposits into, whereas an alternative model is to really think about empowering the students to come with their own perspective and let that somewhat color their process of education, and also allowing the groups that we are trying to educate in different parts of society, instead of telling them what they should be educated about, finding out what it is, being part of that group, talking to them and finding out what sort of education is actually necessary. It's a heavy academic text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but I think it's a really worthwhile read. It's one that I'm probably going to come back and read a few times, but I thought it was a really worthwhile read. Again, on the heavy side. So if you're in the mood for a heavier, more academic, rigorous kind of text, I would put that on your list. The Creative Act by Rick Rubin is about the process of creativity. Rick Rubin being a producer who's worked with tons of notable artists, musicians, and helping them find different ways of approaching their music. I found it was like really nice to listen to as an audiobook. It was a weird, because here's an old white dude, but it's like a Zen Buddhist meditation on an audiobook. So it had a weird vibe to it, but the lessons in it I thought were really interesting. There were a lot of things that got me thinking about different ways of being creative, how one is creative, how to change context and think about things in different ways. I thought it was a really useful book, and it reminded me a bit of Seth Godin's The Practice. I put those two in the same group of, if you're someone who creates, this is a really good book to get your wheels turning when you feel a little stuck. So I really appreciated that book. The Referable Speaker by Michael Port and Andrew Davis. Really great book on taking your speaking as if you're a professional public speaker. It's a really highly recommended book, but it's really about thinking about your audience and delivering your talks in probably a different way than you might normally. When I first got started in speaking, I just took whatever topic came along and I went up there and I gave a talk because I knew about the subject. But rather than just being a subject matter expert, how do you create a talk that's so damn good that people in the audience tell others about it, or they come up and want to hire you to do that talk themselves? And it lays out a really good process for thinking about that, and a lot of really good things that you can do from like a marketing promotion standpoint. But it's a really good book to get you thinking about how to become one of those speakers that can charge higher fees, but also deliver talks that are more impactful and worthwhile. So The Referable Speaker, really good one. Devin Price's book, Laziness Does Not Exist, talks about this myth of what lazy is, which is often applied to people of color, neurodivergent people, and it's society's expectations, it's white supremacy, it's capitalism, it's all of these different things that code certain behaviors as lazy, which oftentimes is just not serving the interests of someone else. And it talks about all of the different things that are called lazy and what they actually often are, such as someone having too much on their plate, too many responsibilities, having executive dysfunction or other neurodevelopmental issues that get in their way of doing things, that this idea of laziness is just ridiculous and it's not true. And what human beings actually need is rest and relaxation. Another book that I recommend in a similar vein is by Celeste Headley called Do Nothing. And there's a lot of books in this kind of world of chill out a little bit, relax. You don't have to constantly be pushing. If I had to nominate another book that I would say is the best book I read this year and the most impactful, I would say Tiny Habits by B.J. Fogg. If you're a fan of Atomic Habits by James Clear, I would strongly recommend Tiny Habits by B.J. Fogg. I liked both books a lot, but I give B.J. Fogg the edge because I found that the method described in his book really helped me to develop habits that I've been able to keep for much longer and has given me a model to think through when I either want to make or break habits. I think it's the best book I've ever read on habits, and I've read probably 4 or 5 at this point. This is the one that I would recommend probably above anything else. Racism Without Racists by Eduardo Bonilla Silva is a book about colorblind racism and essentially this idea of colorblindness as a thing to aspire to and why that's problematic in the context of a society that already has inequalities in it. It's a really interesting book because he does a lot of interviewing. It's not the most interesting book in terms of if you're used to reading really interesting stories of this. He does a lot of interviews and relays what he's heard in a lot of these interviews and what percentage of people talked about different things. But he builds the case for the idea that a lot of the racism that actually is in the world are not from people who are overtly prejudiced or mean ill intent with it, but just have embedded racist views. And it's really interesting. I thought it makes a really good case for just being more thoughtful and reflective on how racism shows up in society. Very interesting book. Reform or Revolution by Rosa Luxemburg. It's a classic leftist, communist, socialist, Marxist kind of text, but it talks about, even if you're not a leftist, it's really interesting to think about the options of how do we improve society? Do we reform it? Do we make slight small adjustments, or do we go for kind of revolution of upending it and making those significant changes? And in this book, primarily, Rosa Luxemburg is laying out the case against reform and why it doesn't work specifically, which I won't get into, but I think it's totally worth reading. There's the Jakarta Method I just recently read, and it is mind-blowing and terrifying, but it really goes through the U.S.'s involvement in anti-communist efforts throughout history, and specifically the violence that we've either directly committed or supported in other territories to essentially, during the Cold War, when there was like the battle of capitalism and communism, this kind of really lays out like, here's what was going on in the background. This is like one of the reasons why so many communist countries fell. And one of the big reasons why it was in Jakarta in Indonesia, there was a method of enacting violence through military coups, basically, US funded military coups that essentially became like a standard method that was then applied over and over throughout South America and other countries that were formulating like left-moving policies. It's really interesting. It's a little bit eye-opening and scary how much the CIA was involved in stuff, and it's just mind-blowing. By the way, Jakarta Methods by Vincent Bevins. Hood Feminism by Mika Kendall. If you're interested in the concept of feminism, which hopefully you are, it's just an idea that women should have equal opportunity and equal rights to men. Seems, but it's a much bigger category than that. But hood feminism is really interesting because what the author does is really talks about the sort of white dominant model of feminism that has traditionally been the model of feminism and brings up some of these other issues that haven't been incorporated into the conversation around feminism and equality and gender equality, and talks about some of these unique things that only people of color really experience. And it's a pretty eye-opening sort of thing because it really sits at the intersection of like gender, sexuality, race. It's just like a really interesting book. I really enjoyed it. I would put that on the list if I were you. Black Skins, White Masks by Frantz Fanon, another classic book. Frantz Fanon, classic author and philosopher. So Black Skins, White Masks is really about the dual consciousness of being a person of color in colonized societies. A really interesting book. talking about what it is to live with that dual consciousness. It gives you a peek behind it. So if you're a person who's never thought of yourself as racialized, if you're a white person, for instance, like you may have never thought of the idea of what it is to be a racialized person in a society. But this book really talks a lot about specifically Black people who were in Algeria, who went back to France and then back to Algeria, and talks a lot about kind of identity and what it is to be seen as Black or to experience racism in different ways. Really interesting book. Strongly recommend that one as well. Blackshirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. Michael Parenti is a phenomenal author. This is a really easy read. This talks a lot about fascism, communism, and capitalism, and the intersection between those different things and how those different forces are coming into conflict. Really good book. Highly recommend that. Short, quick read. I'm Tired of Racism by Sharon Hurley Hall. This is one of the more impactful books I've read about racism, written by an author who's a person of color. And one of the things that Sharon does so well, she's a phenomenal writer, like just a phenomenal writer. Reading her work is both really easy to read, but also it's very deeply experiential because she speaks in stories and really paints very vivid pictures of experiences. And I find that it's almost, some of the time during reading, it was almost like reading a novel because you're embodying and experiencing the main character, which is the author, Sharon Hurley Hall. And she gives these very clear examples as someone who's lived in multiple different places, America and the UK and Barbados, and what it's been like to be a person of color in those different societies and the things that she's experienced that I think a lot of people who haven't been through that experience may not understand are happening. So if you've ever heard the term microaggression and maybe you've blown it off or maybe you somewhat understand it, this book will really help you wrap your hands around it. So those are my essential reads list of the year. So I would strongly recommend those. I'll give you a couple more just because I want to. So I read roughly a little over 43 different things, 1, 2, 3, 4, about 36 books this year, and then like a bunch of book summaries from Blinkist or short form. But I'll give you just a couple more of the other highlights of books that I read. Prove It by Phil Jones and Melanie Diesel. I just finished that. Really great book if you're a marketer and you want to think more about how do you build a case that tells people why they should do business with you. Like you got to focus on proof. You got to make sure that you're not just saying it, but you're proving it. Really great book. And I would recommend it as an ebook or a paperback. Although the audiobook's great. I would listen to Phil Jones read a phone book, but the book is really well suited as like a workbook. So I'd strongly recommend buying that as an ebook. Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher talks a lot about how capitalist realism is this term he defined to come up with a way of describing the idea that capitalism is all that there is, that it's natural. And it's this idea that we've been propagandized into believing that there's nothing else. There's no reason to think of any other idea, of any other way of running society. Everything that's past is irrelevant, and this is what it is. This is the only thing that can and could exist, so much so that we have a hard time actually conceiving of life outside of capitalism. And it's a really interesting book, and I recommend that a lot. Speak Easy by Lou Diamond. If you are interested in having better conversations, cannot recommend this book highly enough. Lou Diamond is my co-host on the Postpod Show. He is the host of the Thrive Loud podcast, and he is an amazing conversationalist. And if you want to be an amazing conversationalist, this book is a really good entry point for you to have some frameworks to pull from and be a better conversationalist. The Big Con by Mariana Mazzucato, and co-author is Rosie Collington. This is a book about the consulting industry, specifically like McKinsey and Bain and all of those, and the horrible effects that they've had in society that often goes unspoken about. Check that one out. The Autistic Brain by Temple Grandin and Richard Panik talks about autism from a like neurological standpoint, like what is happening in the brain. And I just found it fascinating, having only recently discovered in the past few years that I am autistic. And I just found it so interesting. Temple Grandin is like one of the most well-known autistic authors ever. And I found her through Jess Pettit. Shout out to Jess Pettit. Thank you so much for the recommendation. Really good book. Recommend that. Got a couple others. Barracoon, the story of the last black cargo. It is a story of the last freed black slave. I'm not sure if he was actually the last black freed slave, but there was an interview with this person who went by the name, or was given the moniker Barracoon, I think. It's by Zora Neale Hurston. It was a book that I heard about through Carla Trotman on Facebook. She had posted a bunch of different authors and books by black authors, I think during Black History Month, and I picked that one up. And it was really interesting to just hear the experience of someone who can recount what it was to be in Africa and then be brought over as a slave, and then be a freed person, quote unquote freed person in America, and hear their story and hear of the various things that happened to them. It was a little bit, not a little bit, it was a lot heartbreaking, but it was a really interesting story to read about. And it was a book that wasn't released for a long time, and then it got released. All right, what else? Autobiography of Malcolm X. Can't forget that one. That one was wild. So if you saw the Malcolm X movie, you'll recognize a lot of the story in here, because I think Spike Lee probably took very heavily from the autobiography. But it was fascinating to read Malcolm X's whole life and his experience of his ups and downs from his early days and being very into drugs and criminality, and then moving into the Nation of Islam and becoming sober and clean completely, and then his exit from the Nation of Islam. It's just such an interesting book, and I think we don't know a lot about Malcolm X, meaning it's not taught to us in school outside of like Malcolm and Martin. And he's painted as like the bad militant one, but the story is so much bigger than that, and I would really strongly recommend putting that on your list. It's a really interesting book. I read 3 books on superheroes: Capes, Cowls, and the creation of comic book culture. Superman, the Unauthorized Biography, and the Caped Crusade. Superman, obviously about Superman, Caped Crusade about Batman, and superheroes just about the industry in general. All really interesting. If you're into superheroes, I'd recommend them. Also, the audiobook's pretty cool. 2 of them were by Glenn Weldon. They're really good. Okay, we're at the end here. A couple others: The Utopia of Rules and Debt, the First 5,000 Years. Both of these are by David Graeber, the late David Graeber, great author. Debt, the First 5,000 Years goes all the way back and talks about the creation of debt. It unwinds this idea of capitalism emerging out of the barter economy and how that literally is a fable. And there's no evidence of anywhere. He's an archaeologist. Archaeologist, is that the right word? Anthropologist? I forget which. But whatever it is, looks back at societies and unearths information about it. So he goes back and looks at like the entire history of debt, like grain storage and accounting and all these different things, and IOU cultures and jubilees and forgiving of debts and the whole thing. And it really like paints a more vivid picture of how we got to different structures of society, including feudalism and capitalism and things like that. It's a really interesting, it's boring as all hell at certain points because it is just like a chronicling of the entire history of debt, but it's actually really interesting. So I'd put that as like a read something else really interesting at the same time and then turn back to that, because it's really interesting to hear about the history of debt. And the Utopia of Rules is all about how essentially bureaucracy, and there's like this whole push against red tape and bureaucracy and government. And yet at the same time, it keeps getting bigger and bigger, even by the people who are supposedly against it. That essentially that there's just a constant push towards more bureaucracy, and how it doesn't, in some ways it frees us, in some ways it confines us. It's a really interesting book. And then the last book I will recommend is actually the 3rd book in a 3-part series that I finished. The 3rd book at the very beginning of this year, and I read the first 2, but it's going to be a new series on Amazon called The 3-Body Problem. And it's by the author Cixin Liu, I believe. He won a bunch of awards for this book. It's a 3-book series. I don't generally read fiction, so me recommending this, it means a lot here. It's a really interesting sci-fi book about first contact with this other species in the universe and what plays out over that time. The first book's really good. The second book's amazing. 3rd book's a little weird, but still really like a good cap off to the whole thing. But it talks a lot about what happens in society as this happens. Like, how do we as nations come together? How do humans react to this? And it takes place over a number of centuries, I believe. A really good book there. So that was my 2023 wrap up. There's some other books and comic books and like summaries on here, but those are the big ones. If you want any of them, I'm going to put chapters and links to all of the books in the description. Thanks for watching. Happy reading.